Welcome to episode 50 of the Thelma Tapes, brought to you by the Living Memory Association, based at the Wee Museum of Memory in Ocean Terminal, Leith. Today we're joined by Cammy Alexander, who shares with us his wonderful recollections of attending concerts from the 1960s to the 1980s, from the Beatles to Bruce Springsteen, via Curtis Mayfield, the Impressions, the Specials, and many, many more. Back in time we go. Cammy, welcome to the Living Memory Association studio and the Thelma Tapes. Thank you so much for joining us. You're going to be talking to us today about your music memories. Can you just give us a little bit of context, as in where you were brought up and your earliest memories of music?
Thanks very much for inviting me along to this. I was brought up on the south side of Edinburgh in Causeway Side in typical Scottish tenement, first floor flat. I was the middle child of three. I've got an older brother, still alive, and a younger sister. I suppose in the 1950s, with limited access to music then on the radio, I remember though with my brother listening to Radio Luxembourg, and obviously they were playing different music. My brother was, because of his age, being 4 years older than myself, I was born in 1950. He was listening to Buddy Holly, The Shadows, Cliff Richard and so on. And I quite liked that because that was really all that was available. Although I do remember one of my brother's friends having an album by Bobby Bland that I really liked. I later ended up buying myself, but that was unusual. It was fairly mainstream pop music at the time. The big change for me came when the Beatles came along, and although I didn't really rate their first record, Love Me Do, when Please Please Me came out, I really liked that. I can't even remember at that point if we had a record player, but quite early we did get one. Although unfortunately I still can't remember the first single that I bought. But there was a record shop near where we lived that I would go along to and buy. Because of the Beatles, they weren't actually in Edinburgh. They weren't in Edinburgh until quite late. So the first concert I attended, if you like, by myself was actually in Leith at the Eldorado Ballroom. And it was Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas in 1963, December 1963. I was warned very carefully by my mother about going down to Leith, but it wasn't too late at night. I enjoyed the concert very much. And then in 1964, the Beatles in April came to Edinburgh for the first time, and it was to the ABC Lothian Road, now called the Odeon, just to the cinema. The tickets were very hard to get, and in fact, because I was then at secondary school, I started queuing for my ticket on the Friday evening, but the queues had started far earlier, and the tickets were meant to go on sale on the Monday morning, I think, but in fact they got worried about the queues, which had gone all the way in that area, the Tollcross area, right along to Fountain Bridge, and there were so many young girls and young people sleeping basically overnight on the streets with sleeping bags in order to get tickets. And I think they opened the ticket sales on the Sunday morning, so we rushed in and I paid 12 and 6. I was about 60, just over 60 pence for my balcony ticket to see the Beatles in April 1964. And the other nice thing that had happened was my lovely dad had in fact I wanted to go to a rugby international on the Saturday afternoon, and he kept my place in the queue for that time, so I could still get my place, which was a nice thing to do. The concert itself, I enjoyed it, but you could barely hear it because of the screaming, and the amplification wasn't there. I think I've since read that they only did 8 songs. I do remember them doing Twist and Shout, certainly, as part of the concert, and I think George Harrison was already getting pretty annoyed at the Jelly Babies thrown on stage and so on. It wouldn't be the sort of thing that you would enjoy. And they appeared again in October of 1964 and again at the same venue, and I had a slightly better seat at the front. It also, given my later liking particularly for soul music, it was when I saw the first, I suppose you might call, a soul artist, because one of their support acts in October was Mary Wells, who was then a top Motown artist, before the Supremes really made it big, and she appeared, and I remember being impressed by her at the time. I also was at the same venue at the ABC Lothian Road to see the first appearance in Scotland of the Rolling Stones. Really impressive. I think they had only had a kind of minor hit by then with their first single, Come On, and their second one, a Buddy Holly song, Not Fade Away. A lot of the other songs they did were in fact covers of rhythm and blues songs that they had heard rather than the original material, but they were really impressive on stage the first time I saw them. I was also lucky enough to see them again in 1964, this time at the Usher Hall, and again they were at the Usher Hall in 1965. These were all good concerts, although I think the impact they had on the first time was probably the greatest. It's hard to remember all the screaming and the shouting and stuff that went on too. I was also lucky enough, I got a summer job through my brother in a hotel just off Princess Street, and on one of their club gigs actually in Edinburgh, the Kinks were staying. So I was able to meet them, get their autographs. They were all different types actually, and obviously just busy on touring. I was lucky enough also to see them, but not on that particular occasion. I saw them again at the ABC Lothian Road. I think they were support to Jerry and the Pacemakers. They weren't top of the bill then. Marianne Faithfull was part of the bill, and I think I read later on that added to some of the concert dates, including the one in Edinburgh, was the man called David Jones. And of course, David Jones, as we now know, became David Bowie. So I must have seen him in, I think, 1964 or 65, whichever date that was. I also took, when the Kinks were staying in the hotel that I worked in, just as a hall porter, I was asked to take the kind of pink hunting jackets that they wore as part of their clothing up to Pullers of Perth in Hanover Street to get cleaned. I remember bringing them back in their plastic bags, and they didn't look very clean, even after they had been cleaned. That was my only memory of it. And admiring Ray Davies's shirts. He had fantastic check shirts on as well. I suppose after liking the Beatles and R&B and the Rolling Stones and so on, I became interested for a while in blues, and I did see some blues artists, because then they had a very interesting thing in Edinburgh at a club called The Place, called the American Folk Blues Festival, with people like Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee and Memphis Slim. And I think also they had the man who had written one of the Elvis Presley's early hits, Arthur Big Boy Crudup. I didn't see him, but I did see Memphis Slim. When I listened to these blues records, I quite enjoyed them, but when I first heard Thelma Motown records, probably about 65 as well, it really hooked onto my personality, and that's what I came to like. So I became very interested in the Four Tops, Diana Ross and the Supremes, and all the other groups that were attached to them, the Temptations and so on. And that got me really interested in soul music at that time. I was lucky enough to go to university in 1968, and I went through with a friend to Glasgow to see Stevie Wonder. I was lucky enough to see him. I remember it well because it was in April 1968, because we'd both be about 17, because Stevie Wonder is exactly 3 days older than me. We're both Taurians. And again, it was a great concert, but he was already slightly out of the little Stevie Wonder image anymore, and he was doing some covers of things like the Beatles' We Can Work It Out. It was still a very good concert, and I enjoyed it a great deal, but I remember somebody in the Glasgow audience shouting out, "Give us Uptight, Stevie." They wanted some of these other things. I later found out that his career had been a bit doubtful at that point, because after being the child prodigy genius little Stevie Wonder, Thelma Motown as an organisation weren't quite sure what to do with him, and they got a woman called Sylvia Moy to become producer and writer of some of these records, and that kept him, if you like, in the public eye with songs like Uptight and so on, until he was allowed the artistic freedom that later became him obviously world famous and so on. And just as an aside as well, I joined Facebook so I could wish Stevie Wonder a happy birthday at one time, and he was, well, I don't think he was well pleased, but I just laughed at the image where he's exactly 3 days older than me. And out of all the people that I've read about, he comes across really well as a person, as well as his musical ability. So I think that was in 1960, I'm trying to remember, it'd been 1968 or 69. I also had gone down to Manchester. My older brother was then working in Liverpool, and Diana Ross and the Supremes were appearing in Manchester. So I decided to get tickets for that, and I went down to Manchester on an overnight train. The train guard was really kind, because he let me, it arrived, well, not an overnight train, I can't remember. It arrived early in the morning, but he let me sleep on in the carriage when I was sound asleep, and then eventually said, "You'll have to get off because the train's going somewhere else." And I had to wait for my brother coming through from Liverpool. I went to both shows at the Manchester Free Trade Hall, and I was then really taken by Diana Ross and Supremes. It was a fantastic concert, the opening one, with the stage in complete darkness, and then the opening bars of You Keep Me Hanging On coming out and introducing Diana Ross and the Supremes. And in fact, that particular concert is mentioned in one of the Tamla Motown documentaries, because they were trying to get the Supremes to do lots of show tunes like Lady and the Tramp and so on, and they wanted to stick with the other material. So, as I say, I went to both shows, really enjoyed that. I bought some records in Manchester, kept a record of that, because at that time I was keeping a small diary of that concert. So that was really enjoyable as well. I carried on really basically enjoying soul music very much. It was very difficult to see soul acts in Scotland, although I later discovered that some of them were appearing over on the west coast of Scotland because there was a US naval base there and they would be guest artists there. But they weren't really appearing much in Scotland, as I remember. I'd also gone down to London with friends again in 1968 and managed to see Benny King in a London nightclub, and he was fantastic as well. As I moved on to the 1970s, I was still going to all kinds of different concerts, although soul music was still my preference. My big breakthrough, if you like, as well, was that I decided in 1972, I got a summer job in the United States of America in Chicago, and I was able to go to concerts in Chicago as well as concerts somewhere else before I travelled around in the States. And I still kind of... I had a job in a hotel. Again, it was called a bellhop, but it was basically a hotel porter. But I was lucky enough in that by then my big hero that I'd been down to London to see earlier in 1972 was Curtis Mayfield, who had done his first solo show in London's Rainbow Theatre after leaving his group The Impressions. So I'd become a big admirer of his style, and I'd first heard his famous song People Get Ready being performed in an Edinburgh nightclub, Magoo's, by Jimmy James and the Vagabonds, who were a fantastic group on stage. With the first time I'd seen, they had two lead singers, Jimmy James and a man called Count Prince Miller, and their bass guitarist later became Rod Stewart's bass guitarist, Philip Chen. I just remember being a fantastic live act. It was so exciting. But obviously by the time I was in the United States, I was really into soul music. I was lucky enough to see Jackie Wilson perform as well and meet him. And also had the opportunity, well, I managed to rig it when I found out that Curtis Mayfield was going to be in concert in Chicago, that I managed to wangle it, I would say. I said I was possibly doing an interview or an article for a British Soul magazine because I had a business card to do with a British Soul magazine. And the manager in the theatre was kind enough. I think he knew I was up to, since I never had a tape recorder or a pen or anything, but I asked if I could, and he said, come and see me after the show. So I was able to be taken backstage after the show and meet my hero. And we talked about his concert in London, and I spoke to his wife about shopping in London. That's what she was interested in. So I was really pleased with that. And I was also lucky enough, on my day off from my hotel job, I'd gone to the studio which Curtis Mayfield co-owned in Chicago called Curtom, and the receptionist there was kind enough, although he wasn't there, probably away touring, she was kind enough to say, well, come back, and she got me signed photographs with my name on them from The Impressions and from Curtis Mayfield, which obviously are still pride of place in my house now. You can still see the drawing pin marks when I brought them first back from there, because I was still at that point staying in my parents' house. Saw a whole number of other acts there. I saw the Temptations on the 3rd of September when they were singing the song that begins with those lines, it was the 3rd of September. I saw Bill Withers, The Fifth Dimension, Donny Hathaway, Mary Clayton, Ike and Tina Turner. So it was a real musical, I suppose, education in a way, and all concerts that I enjoyed. When I came back, I saw other concerts at the Odeon. I remember seeing Led Zeppelin there. I didn't really enjoy that. It wasn't really my cup of tea. I think I saw Iron Maiden as well. That was even less my cup of tea. I was impressed, however, though, when I saw in the 1970s, 1974, I think, Roxy Music, again at the Odeon in Clark Street. Absolutely fantastic on stage. When I later saw Brian Ferry solo at the Playhouse, I didn't find him so impressive. very samey, but Roxy Music had a great stage show, and musically it was very exciting. I was also, I think in 1970 or 71, the Four Tops, again, other of my heroes, came to Edinburgh, and again, great concert. I took some Instamatic photographs of it. I had a good seat near the front. I remember at the interval, after we'd seen the opening acts, one of the support acts was a good black American singer, Thelma Houston, but the other acts, I can't even remember their names. But as I went to go to the toilet from a seat in the stalls, people in the balcony were shouting out things like, "I knew you'd be here, Cammy." And so to see, so it was a very good concert as well. In later years, I've seen the Four Tops 2 or 3 times since. I managed to see the Drifters at the Playhouse, where I was one of the, I would estimate, 10% of men there. It was mostly women, but great mixed audience. And when I did see the Drifters, one of their original members was still singing with them, a man called Johnny Moore, and they went through all their hits. I think at one time somebody said that there are 23 versions of the Drifters appearing in different venues all over the world. So that's what I would say about that bit of the concert.
It's a remarkable roll call of superstar acts that you've seen, Cammy. It's just incredible. I had so many questions, but I was just really enjoying letting you talk and go through one big name after the other. That's just incredible. There can't be many people who are still around who've seen as many superstar bands as you have. You know, that's phenomenal. In your early days of going to gigs, would you go with a mate or a girlfriend or family, or was it you on your own, or was there
Billy J. Kramer was me on my own.
What age would you be then at that point again?
I'm only 13.
And yet
when I
you're
see
not,
the Beatles, I'm 40. No,
so you're not
I'm
fazed
still
by
13.
being on your own at a gig at all?
No, I was all right. It was all right, yeah. I don't think I've ever felt really, have I felt scared? No. The one in Chicago where I saw Jackie Wilson in a black club, that was a bit different, because I'm the only white man there that I could see. I'm the only white. There's some white girls there with black boyfriends, but it was quite far south side as I remember it. So scared, it was awkward at the end to get a taxi. It was just a bit awkward. I came out at the end, and I think Jackie Wilson, I'd met him, and I think he was doing 2 other shows, as it were, in the one night. I only went to the first one. Can't remember the timings. So I went to the foyer of the club to see about a taxi, and I asked one of the security staff, bouncers, could I get a cab? And he said, yeah, just go right out in the street. And I said, well, I'm not sure about going out in the street. And then, so I was hanging around, wonder what to do next. And then the manager of the club spoke to me, can I help you? He was very kind. And I said, oh yes, I was just wondering if we could get a cab. And then he spoke to the other security man and said, get the man a cab. So he went outside, got me a cab ready. It was a black cab driver, and as I went out of the club, right enough, there were a whole number of people standing outside, and I can't remember if there were some comments, but I just went straight into the cab, got a cab in at the centre of town, and then I went back to where I was staying, which was away on the north side of Chicago, because it was a student hall of residence. They were all away for the summer, so I was staying there. So that's the only time, I remember. I went with another friend of mine to the Roxy Music gig, and later on I went with the same friend to see David Bowie in concert in Glasgow at the Apollo. And again, out of concerts that I've seen, that was very, very impressive. That was a fantastic concert. He did a wide range of his material, and he had a great presence on stage. And I've seen other acts who I actually liked on record, but they didn't have the same presence. I would say I would include in that. I'd seen Peter Frampton, again, didn't really have the presence. Boz Scaggs, not really have any presence, as I've mentioned, and the same with Brian Ferry when I saw him solo.
Yeah, and so seeing David Bowie kind of when he's really famous at that point, did you connect it in any way to having seen Davy Jones, or was Davy Jones doing mostly covers, or was it completely different?
No.
Did you have any memories of him as a potential star when he was Davy Jones?
No, I didn't have any memory of that. I only found out about that even later. And in fact, I've only got a vague memory of when I saw the Kinks. I do remember seeing them in concert, and I found the ticket that I had for that concert. But Jerry and the Pacemakers were the top of the bill, and I think Gene Pitney was on the bill. I do have the memory of Gene Pitney, but I don't really have the memory of Jerry and the Pacemakers.
Yeah.
They maybe didn't have the same impression. Whereas, as I said, the other concert in the 1980s that made a really big impression was at a club called Tiffany's, when I saw the reggae band Toots and the Maytals.
Oh, yeah.
They were absolutely fantastic in concert. And I remember Toots turning round to the bass guitarist and saying, "What town am we in?" And the bass guitarist said, "Edinburgh." And Toots said, "Edinburgh, you're in to hear some good music tonight." And they were just brilliant in concert. Yeah. Absolutely fantastic. The other concert, well, I don't know if you can say it and you'd maybe edit out, that was very good at Tiffany's at that time, but again, given the circumstances, was Gary Glitter. Gary Glitter was actually really good in concert. And I saw him again later at the Playhouse, but again, it wasn't so good then. I think you're a bit older. It's one of these things. But I find all that quite strange as well musically, because people still play lots of Phil Spector records, fantastic producer and so on, and yet Phil Spector was a convicted murderer.
Yeah, it's whether you can detach the artist from the music, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Even going back as far as the classical composers, some of them were terrible, terrible people who did terrible things.
Indeed, exactly so. So I think these ones, I think it's probably partly to do with when you're young, but as I mentioned earlier, when I got to see Bruce Springsteen in 1981, and already you were just attracted because the music sounded different, the assimilation of, I suppose, the kind of working class American ideas, and just good. And it turns out, of course, Bruce Springsteen, it's no coincidence that he's a great admirer of soul music in itself, and it's a huge influence on his music. So I find that interesting. And as well as being at that first concert, which a good friend of mine, his brother's girlfriend at the time, smuggled a tape recorder in. And I was able to get a cassette tape of that. I think it was in May 1981 at the Playhouse in Edinburgh. And it was I think the first lot were cancelled. They were meant to be in March, but then they were in May. And he did 2 nights at the Playhouse. And I was lucky enough to see him years later in Glasgow at Hampden. And again, although we were miles away and it was a big screen, he still put on a very good 3-hour-long show. And I saw him, I think, last year at Murrayfield. My daughter got me a late ticket for that. But I had to ask one of the security people for a seat at the side because it was a standing room only. And again,
I think... He's still doing 3 hours?
Yeah, I think he did just short of 3 hours again. I would say each of the concerts, given the fact that he was older, were slightly diminishing, but the quality of the sound and the band were always just as good. And I do like the fact that he doesn't try and say, well, this is new material, I'm not going to do anything. He really appreciates that his audience are there for a reason, and the audience have carried on supporting him. Particularly, I noticed that the one in Glasgow, where people were holding up their favourite songs in cardboard, and he was able to, the band were so good they were able to do some of them. The other nice memory of the Glasgow concert that I saw was he got a young girl up on stage and said, "What's your favourite?" And she actually had said, "Oh, it's my mother that really likes you." And he said, "Well, let's get your mother over here." And then so they helped bring the girl's mother up on stage, and the girl's mother was so taken by this she couldn't speak. It was like her daughter had to interpret for her and saying, "This is our favourite." Then he said, "We'll do that favourite song." It was a lovely thing,
He always seems like a good guy. So to hear that sort of story,
it's good. Brilliant. Yes.
But I was speaking to one of my mates the other night, actually, who was recently at the Oasis gigs. Yeah. He goes to an awful lot of concerts. And I don't know if you found this, but he was saying that at Murrayfield, the sound was absolutely spot on. It was an amazing kind of, as Liam Gallagher would say, biblical experience. But he was saying he was at Murrayfield gigs 10 years ago or so, and the sound used to just disappear. So I don't know whether it's just advances in technology or if they've just mastered how to put on gigs there. But he was saying in the old days, if you were near the back, it was just away in the sort of vortex of the
I think stadium. I think that's interesting about the stadium, because the Bruce Springsteen one that I saw last year or a year and a half ago, whenever it was, I thought the sound was good in my standing position in front of the stage. But a friend of mine who had a seated position further back, he didn't think the sound was so good. And he used to work either for STV or BBC. So perhaps it just varies at your point, in the actual place where you are in it.
And my mate's usually got good tickets because he's in the business. So
That's very good.
he's probably hearing it from the best possible spot.
That's the other nice connection with the Beatles is when the Beatles on their 2 trips to Scotland, and they were doing, I think in this order, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee and Aberdeen. I think that's what they were doing, although they had been in Scotland earlier on in their career. But I didn't know about these gigs. Either I was too young or they weren't publicised.
And you were saying, sorry, that when you saw the Beatles the first time, they played 8 songs and it was mostly screaming. But you said you saw them a second time. Was the screaming as loud the second time? Was it a similar experience, or could you hear more of it?
I was nearer the front, but I think the screaming was just as loud. It was just as crazy. It was just as nuts at that time, and I suppose it's just the kind of experience. I was trying to think of any other. Well, what I found out is they didn't stay in Edinburgh. They stayed at I think in the April concert they stayed at the Roman Camp Hotel in Callander.
Yeah, we've got a picture of them in our photo archive, in the Thelma photo archive. We've got a picture of them there.
Yes, there. And although I've not stayed there, I've seen the suite of rooms that they stayed in. The manager has showed me around. But the other hotel they stayed in is up near, I think, Lough Erne, called the Four Seasons Hotel. And I don't know if they advertise that, but that's where they also stayed. But I think people from local schools got word that they were staying there, so it still became very difficult. And when you see the pictures of the Beatles then, I suppose George Harrison in particular, and maybe all of them, they're just getting fed up at getting chased and getting your hair pulled and all that kind of thing. They just kind of had enough of that, and I suppose, you can respect that and so on. Later on, when I visited Liverpool with my wife, we did all the kind of Beatles tour, and it was quite funny because they show you the houses where they lived and so on. Although I think there was a risk of Ringo Starr's house being knocked down with some kind of redevelopment. But when we were standing in front of George Harrison's house, he was my favourite at the time. I always wanted to be the same height as him, 5'11". Didn't quite make it. But when we were standing there were other people who had come off the tour bus. And I'd said to the driver, when I saw the Beatles. And a German lady was saying, "You have seen the Beatles? You have seen them?" And I said, yes, I saw them at that time. And the tour guide had a photograph of himself with Paul McCartney, but obviously he was too young to have seen the Beatles. The driver could have seen them, but it turned out that he hadn't actually seen them, although he was a real Liverpudlian. And we just did the other things like go to the cavern. But I found it a little bit unnerving, although they had great bits of memorabilia, and you're obviously there in the redone cavern. I think at that time they were showing the European Football Championships on the screen. So you're in the cavern, and it's a kind of bit, but I suppose that's fine. I've seen some Beatles tribute bands as well, and they've been quite good, just keeping that. And I don't begrudge them that.
Yeah. And are you still going to gigs, Cammy? Now
and again I would go on a special occasion if I really fancy something. I saw that in the Queen's Hall, Toots and the Maytals were on there.
No Toots left, was there?
No Toots, no. Just his daughter seemingly appearing. And I would be quite glad to see what the version was. And I went recently to the Queen's Hall to see a kind of British/American soul legend, P.P. Arnold. Mm-hmm. And she was very good, very good. Still a very good singing voice, and was able to pace it with stories and so on of that. And so I enjoyed that as well. But as regards modern acts, I've got friends who would maybe recommend something, but I think I would have to be sort of led along. And I would be willing to give it a try, but I would go to the odd gig. But I suppose I'm not quite actively looking up things now and saying that. And certainly I'd want to have somewhere where there's a seat now, I think. I wouldn't be standing for 3 hours, saying that. Although I've got a good friend who went to see Stevie Wonder before his recent British tour. He did a kind of opening one somewhere near Blackpool, Lytham St Anne's or somewhere like that. And he said it was very good. And so I would just take that and enjoy it. And I would certainly go and see him again, but I don't know if I would maybe travel down to London if it was something special that I thought was taking place. I had one other lucky break because I did a spell in Edinburgh as a DJ in, 1969. Yes, I was a student. There was an Edinburgh nightclub called Romano's at the West End. I think it later became Habitat or something, I can't remember. quite near the Grosvenor Bar, which is still there. And I did a Wednesday and Saturday there. I also showed my musical bias. People were asking for certain records, like I remember asking for Shocking Blues version of Venus. And I would say, oh, the other DJ must have misplaced it. And that's so I could play Ain't Too Proud to Beg by The Temptations or Jackie Wilson's Higher and Higher. I lost that job, unfortunately, because I wanted again to go and see a soul show in London, which I'd found out about. I bought a magazine which was a monthly, and then I think it maybe became a weekly, called Blues and Soul magazine, and it would tell you who was coming to Britain. So although I'd missed the Stax Volt tour in 1965 or 66, it had been in Glasgow. I've spoken to people who were at it, and that featured Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, and Booker T and the MGs.
Wow.
But anyway, I decided to go to London because there was a show called Soul Explosion, and it featured Sam and Dave, Joe Tex, Clarence Carter and Arthur Conley. Sam and Dave had, I think, a 23-piece band with them, with 4 saxophones and 4 trumpets at the Albert Hall. It was just the best thing ever. And in fact, I went to see the whole show again the next night at the Fairfield Halls in Croydon with my brother. I went to the Albert Hall by myself. But when I'd arranged to go to the gig, I'd got a DJ to sub for me at the nightclub, but the manager of the club wasn't having it. He said, I employ you. It's either you or you can just take your books. So I lost the DJ job. But to this day, it was still worth it because the show was fantastic. Clarence Carter in a pink corduroy suit. Sam and Dave were unbelievable. Joe Tex, again, dancing as good as James Brown and doing lots of up-tempo songs. Arthur Conley had a great voice, so I don't regret that. And I've got a friend of mine up in Edinburgh now, and she was living in London at the time, and she was at the same show, and we shared that same, what a great experience it was.
Did you ever see James Brown live?
Yes, I saw James Brown. Strange circumstances. We were on holiday in between the Spanish-French border, and James Brown was appearing at a place called Honday. I think it's in France. Anyway, he was appearing at a pelota court, which is the game a bit like squash played kind of outdoor. And I remember them introduced in French, Le Roi de Funk. Et maintenant, Le Roi de Funk. James Brown. And it was a good show. You know, I don't know if the venue was, the best suited to the occasion.
Did they do the whole putting the cape on?
Yes, they still did all that bit. And, I've got a lot of books now on soul music. In my later years, although I'd seen the Temptations, let me see, possibly 2 or 3 times, when we came back in the 1990s from holiday, there was a thing called, I'm trying to remember it, the reunion of the Temptations. They weren't allowed to call it the Temptations. And basically, the original falsetto singer, Eddie Kendricks, the original lead singer, David Ruffin, and his replacement, Dennis Edwards, were touring as a reunion of the Temptations, doing Temptations material, and that was on at the Usher Hall. I think it was something strange like a Thursday night. It was still a good concert, although for some reason David Ruffin, another of my heroes, sang a bit of My Girl in German for no reasons. I also became almost like an older groupie because after the concert we were deciding to go for a drink, a vehicle came by, a limousine came by, and I thought, that's for them. And I rushed over, I think I ran over, and I managed to meet David Ruffin, just shake his hand briefly and thank him. He said to me, God bless you, man. Sadly, David Ruffin, the lead singer of the Temptations, I think later that year was found dead with a crack cocaine overdose in Philadelphia. But it still was a good show and gave me a chance to see them. And Dennis Edwards, in his own right, the lead singer on Papa Was a Rolling Stone, he had a great voice too.
That's where the lyrics from, isn't it? The 3rd of September. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, he had that. So I suppose the kind of soul music's had a huge kind of influence in that. And also, I've got another friend who was very much into soul music all the way through that period of time. And I was going to go to London to see the Impressions, Curtis Mayfield's group, were appearing. But he said, they're on in Blackpool at a Northern Soul convention. So what happened about that? I decided to go. He said he would give me a lift in his car. I managed to get the oddest bed and breakfast I've ever been in my life, but managed to get something nearby. But through a friend of mine who had become the main supplier of Northern Soul records for the whole of Britain. Yeah, a man called John Anderson, he's since passed away. He put me in touch with the promoter of this Northern Soul, Blackpool Soul Weekender. And through that, I was able to meet the Impressions, including two of the original. One of them was a replacement, obviously, for Curtis Mayfield. But two of the originals, I took down copies of the photographs I had of them from 1972. And so they were just laughing and smiling at that and said, hey, look at our shoes and look at our clothes then. And one of them I was able to ask, I'm not sure, I think he may still be alive, a man called Fred Cash. I said, out of all the acts you've appeared with and seen, who's your own favourite? And he said, Ray Charles, man, Brother Ray. That's who he picked out. And again, that's one of my regrets, that he had been on in Edinburgh many years ago, but either through lack of funds or missing out, I hadn't been able to see Ray Charles. And the night after I'd seen Stevie Wonder, I remember this, Nina Simone was at the Usher Hall, but I probably couldn't ask my parents for any more money because I was still borrowing money for clothes, records, and going to football matches. Yeah. So it was a bit excessive.
And when we get to the 80s, are you still going to gigs throughout the 80s?
Probably not so much, but that's certainly when I saw Bruce Springsteen, first of all.
Did you get into ska at all? Did you like ska music?
Yes, I liked a bit of ska. I saw, let me see, the record shop owner, or Bruce and Brian Finlay, put on a reggae show at what is now the Festival Theatre, but the Empire. Yeah. And I think they had the Pioneers. I can't remember all the other group. The Pioneers had a hit, and I remember having this record single, Long Shot, Kick the Bucket. Yeah. And I remember one of the other reggae ones on the show, he came on stage with a can of McEwen's Export. That would be quite unusual at the time, coming on with that. But that was a good show that they promoted there. And as I said, I suppose the other one was Toots and the Maytals. I don't know if Bob Marley and the Wailers were ever in Edinburgh. I think they were in Glasgow.
Did you see Bob Marley and the Wailers?
No, I didn't. No. I would have liked to have seen them. I'm trying to think of any other Glasgow concerts that I saw. I think the David Bowie one that I mentioned earlier, and probably the Bruce Springsteen one in Edinburgh would be my favourite non-soul ones, you know. But I think through time your memory fades a little bit.
But it's been phenomenal, the musical memories. I don't think anyone can have a back catalogue of gigs quite like that, Cammy. It's amazing. If I gave you the choice, you could see one gig again, what would you go for?
Oh, gosh.
Or let's go to, who would you like to have seen that you didn't manage to catch, apart from Bob Marley?
Bob Marley and the Wailers. Aretha Franklin, on a good day. Yeah. But my friend who lives abroad, he saw her in Paris. Mm. And he said she was quite good, but from what I've read about her, that would just depend on the mood. Yeah. Well, there's one other concert that I've just remembered about, well, more than one other. I did see the Animals at the Usher Hall, and they were very good in concert. I also saw Chuck Berry, and I think the support for Chuck Berry, or one of the support was, Elkie Brooks was one of the supporters, but also the Moody Blues, I think, were support. But it was on the day that the Moody Blues Go Now, the first version of the Moody Blues, went to number one. I've also since heard that Chuck Berry was notorious. He wanted always to be paid in cash, and the promoters were about to write him a cheque, but he said he either got cash or he wouldn't appear at Usher Hall. So they had to go down to the Royal Bank of Scotland at the West End to make sure they would get enough cash to pay Chuck Berry. Because that's probably because of his past experiences and so on.
And I think you used to have to pay him extra cash to do an encore as well. Because I saw him at the Playhouse and he didn't play an encore. So they'd obviously not shelled out for that extra bit. He was still brilliant.
But that's all extra. Yeah, I saw in later years, I saw Martha Reeves at the Assembly Rooms, and she was well past her best, and I accepted that. I wasn't expecting the 19-year-old version, but there were no Vandellas, and the pickup band that she had were really poor. Yeah. You know, I saw her glancing round at them thinking, she's obviously thinking, what are you doing? Yeah. What's happening here? But she made a brave fist of it, and again, through the promoter, I managed to meet her afterwards, just lucky. And she said, I said, oh, I've been a fan since the 1960s. And she said, you must have been like one of those hippies I was talking about. I said, no. I said, I didn't go for that. And she did a brief bit of the song. I wish I'd taped it. She said to me, oh, you'd be like that song, driving in the back, sunroof top, digging the scene with a gangster lean. And she sang this little bit of song to me.
Yeah.
And I came away really high from it.
Yeah.
It was just
Cool.
a lovely moment. And the promoter took him a photograph with Martha Reeves. I know other people that were disappointed, but then your expectation is that you're going to get the version that you got then. I don't have that expectation now.
Yeah.
In the same way that if I go dancing now, I don't have the same expectation.
But your legs will move in quite the same way.
I know.
Yeah. I remember I went to see the Specials when they reformed in 2011, and it was phenomenal because I got into ska music through that second wave of the British ska, like the Beat and the Selector, and Madness and Bad Manners and the Specials. And so I was really I used to go to Misty's in Portobello and dance to ska music at Misty's with all the skinheads and their Doc Martens and their long jackets.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And so by the time 2011 came around, when they reformed, again I was thinking it's not going to be quite what I remember of the music, but they were so good. Oh God, the Specials at the SECC or somewhere in Glasgow. That's where it was actually. Yeah.
Yes.
And they were selling their own. I've still got my T-shirt. They were selling. There was dodgy merchandise stalls outside, but the dodgy merchandise stalls were run by the Specials as well, as well as the ones.
Even better, even the official ones.
Yeah.
That's good. I like that.
Yes.
I had forgotten that as well, Barry. I had seen the Specials and Selecta on the first time, on the first time round. And actually, I had an argument with someone about that because they said, they're just copy and derivative. And I said, but if it's introducing people to Prince Buster and so on, that's a good thing. That's like the way I go. So the Beatles were doing versions of Smokey Robinson songs and or Mary Wells songs or something. So I suppose indirectly that's what gets me into that, And I think even though I was kind of flirted with some blues music and even had bought a Jimmy Reed album, once I heard the kind of up-tempo stuff of the Four Tops, and even my ringtone, my text tone is "Move On Up" by Curtis Mayfield, and surprise, surprise, and my ringtone is part of the Four Tops. It's the same old song. So that's how I've kept these things, So I think, and I like the idea of music and musical memories bringing people together. I like that.
Oh, absolutely.
And I certainly found that when I went to Blackpool for the soul music thing. It was just such a kind of positive experience, the music. And again, I think the other guest artist was Little Anthony of Little Anthony and the Imperials. The only difficulty he had was he was singing songs that he probably hasn't sung since he made them 40 years before. Up-tempo songs that a Northern Soul crowd wanted to hear. Yeah.
That feeling of music bringing people together. I mean, the recent Oasis concerts is that in a nutshell, isn't it? Because it's really just memories, but it's still a band, they're still tight, they're still performing really well, but it's about people hearing all those tunes again, people talking about it like a religious experience.
My son-in-law's going to see them next week in London. He lives in Cambridge. Oasis have never been my cup of tea, but as we've agreed, I respect people's right, to say that they would like this. My other friend, though, who's a big soul music and gospel fan, I've seen quite a few gospel groups over the years. He's totally not tolerant of all that. Doesn't even like the Beatles. He said he's just taking other music and just copying it. He's very much an originator in that sense.
I mean, the Stones, who you saw as well, have taken quite a bit of flack for that, haven't they?
Yes. Well, in one way they say, they haven't progressed or changed. And, I've got a former work colleague who's a big Rolling Stones fan and has seen them the last time they were in Edinburgh. And I suppose if someone had said to me, oh, here's a ticket for you, and, I would have gone along in comparison. But I quite like the fact of seeing them then and just, in fact, the most outstanding one, though, at that time, visually, even more than Mick Jagger, was Brian Jones, because of his blonde hair and the gig he was wearing, as I remember, it's funny how you remember these strange things, a white polo neck and a chalk stripe waistcoat. That's what he had on a chalk. It was just very, very striking image that he had on stage, rather than the later kind of Keith Richard and Mick Jagger partnership. People thought at the Usher Hall gig that Ike and Tina Turner had been supporting them. But in fact, because I still had the programme, it was a black American duo called Charlie and Inez Fox, who were a brother and sister. They were unusual in one bit, because during the show, he came down the side aisle at the Usher Hall carrying Inez Fox, carrying her, and then went onto the stage. I remember that bit about the concert.
Cammy, that has just been brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing your memories with us. And what we'll maybe try and do actually is we'll put this out as a regular Living Memory Association podcast, but we'll also maybe try and put it on YouTube as audio, and then gather some of your ticket stubs and your pictures and stuff from over the years and match them up to the stories,
right,
so that people can see them. But let me just say again, thank you so much for sharing your memories, and we're going to gather some more stories from you for the Living Memory Association TikTok channel. So I'll look forward to hearing more about your life and about growing up. But for the moment, Cammy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Barry. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you. Many thanks again to Cammy Alexander for sharing his brilliant memories with us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find more via our website at www.livingmemory.org.uk. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and TikTok by searching for the Living Memory Association. That will allow you to see thousands of photos and hundreds of videos which will bring the past to life. Until next time, we bid you farewell.